Hello, and welcome to the Daring to Succeed podcast. I'm your host, Juliana Yao Jorgen, and today I wanted to talk to you about inaction and indecision. We all know that situation where we know exactly what we need to do, we've made the decision, we've even told ourselves this is the plan, but just somehow it never actually happens. We either procrastinate or tell ourselves we need to look at it again, or sometimes even occupy ourselves with something else just to avoid doing the thing. What I find fascinating with some of my clients is that what is holding them back isn't actually not knowing how to go forward with things or needing a better decision matrix, or just telling themselves, okay, today's the day I'm going to do this thing. What's beneath all of that is actually usually something that hasn't really been fully looked at. And because of the way we've been trained, especially in corporate, being told, don't overanalyze things, don't make a big fuss over things. We've kind of convinced ourselves that we need to just do the thing already and get it over with. But if you're listening, you're probably knowing that feeling where maybe you even go through with it and you just have that overwhelming feeling of dread as you're doing it, as you're waiting for things to unfold. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So, I've got a couple of examples for you from real coaching experiences. The first, especially if you're joining us from LinkedIn, may be very familiar for you. I've shared different variations of this use case to look at different parts of this very intricate story. Basically, my client came to me saying that he needed to work on procrastination. And when I asked him for an example, he had a very concrete one for me. And as the managing director of a fairly large firm, he had a conversation that he needed to have with a key staff member. This was somebody who was in a leadership position, had responsibilities of mentoring more junior staff, and also was critical in making sure that the technical work that their teams had to look after were sound. So my client was a little apprehensive about the conversation because it was around the staff member's upcoming retirement. So, based on the contractual agreement, this was imminent within the next year. And my client found that he kept putting off the conversation. And we're talking about a very seasoned individual here. Um, when we went through the coaching process, what we found is that he didn't actually need help with how to have the conversation or how to manage his succession planning and all of the usual stuff that comes up when this type of scenario is brought up in coaching. Figured that out pretty quickly, and after a little bit of exploration, what we found is that my client was actually struggling not with the actual conversation, not with figuring out how to replace this individual, but the concept that the business wouldn't actually be impacted and that he would be able to find a direct equivalent for this individual to replace them with. So, what was happening is that he was setting himself an extremely high bar in terms of what the follow through would be based on that conversation. When we worked through the process, he eventually came to the realization that obviously there's no way to replace someone exactly as they are. You're always going to have a slightly different profile, different experience, even different soft skills and familiarity with the company and the industry. Once he kind of came to terms with that realization and saw factually that he needed a plan that dealt with not just generic succession planning, but how to replace this individual based on who his real options were, everything else kind of fell into place. Not only did he have the conversation and much sooner than the deadline that he had set for himself, my client was very pleased with the result because what ended up happening was the individual didn't want to retire right away. So they kind of put together a plan together on what that would look like, communication, and all the rest. But the real aha moment, as we like to call them, that unlock this so-called procrastination for my client wasn't about knowing how to do the thing or um, coaching himself out of feeling lazy, as he said, but really was more about really understanding those thoughts, those expectations that were beneath the surface that he never fully took the time to inspect. And once those were out in the open, everything else was so easy. The next example I have is another leader who had a situation with an employee, and this one wasn't quite as fun. So, my client had inherited a team from someone who was very disengaged. And when she stepped in to take over that team, they were actually without a direct manager for quite some time. So, those of you who are a little bit seasoned in leadership know what that looks like when you're kind of stepping into not only a team that's been neglected for a little bit, but um, hasn't even had full attention from a strong leader before that leader had departed. So she went about all of her usual things with assessing the team and making sure that people were properly supported. But in that process, she identified somebody who was not only underperforming, but no longer really a fit for the type of work that the team needed. The individual was somebody who, we'll say, wasn't exactly a team player, and not only was the staff member, um, we'll say, not delivering on what she needed to, but she was also creating extra work for the rest of the team. So my client worked through the usual things with HR, with her leadership team to make sure that the individual understood their job responsibilities and was properly supported to be able to succeed. But eventually, they came to the conclusion that this individual needed to be put on a performance improvement plan. And my client went through the usual steps for that. Where she got stuck was when she had to have the very difficult conversation with the individual about, okay, we've been through this PIP for a little bit. You're not really showing improvement. Here are the different options, including your departure from the company. And this is where my client's stress level spiked to the point where she had lots of sleepless nights, not really sure how to proceed, and generally very um, agitated and overwhelmed by the situation. She knew she couldn't put off the conversation for too long because of their company's standard HR processes. Um, but in the end, when she came into coaching, she kept coming back to, how do I do this? How do I do this properly? What do I need to worry about? Is there something else that I needed to worry about? And what was really interesting is that she actually had the answer to every one of those questions, yet she was still in this highly agitated, very overwhelmed, and very stressed mindset. And that in itself led to not necessarily her inaction, but a prolonged internal monologue before she could actually have this conversation with the individual. When we dug in deeper, what we found is that obviously it wasn't that she didn't know how to performance manage someone. She was very well versed in her company's HR policies and um, didn't have any problem following the due protocol. What was happening was that external voices were getting inside her head and creating doubt. So what had happened is that she was discussing sort of the safe version of this with trusted friends, as we do. And her friends were telling her counter stories about how they've been on the receiving side of being put on performance or being laid off for what they believed were not justified reasons and going after the company. These stories kind of nestled themselves into my client's mind, and because she is fairly risk adverse, she became very worried about her personal liability for this entire process. So her concern in the end, when we did the digging around, when we went through the process to kind of eliminate what wasn't the problem, what we were left with was the fact that she didn't want to be personally liable, or we'll say at the receiving end of an an employment lawsuit, because of these actions. Once we figured out that that was what was holding her back, that was what was keeping her up at night, um, everything else was really easy. We were able to sort of appeal to her executive brain, to kind of work through the problem and figure out what her actual liability was and um, what might be an actual plausible outcome to the conversations. And rather than going into generalities, we really dug into this specific employee, the case that she had built, and the way her company usually handles performance management and employee exits. Once we did that and took the time to kind of unravel everything with her executive brain, her protective brain was able to kind of stand down and say, okay, I sounded the alarm. We've looked at this properly. Um, we won't go as far as saying there's nothing to worry about, but at least we have a full understanding of what the real risks are and um, what we can do if certain things happen. um, Luckily, with her, the employee decided to exit on her own terms. So everything kind of worked out for the best for both of them. But in the interim, at least, my client was able to sleep at night and finally refocus some of her energy on the rest of the team and her own mandates, rather than everything being taken over by this one employee. The last situation I wanted to walk you through is a fun one. So, my client is what I wouldn't call an overachiever. I personally don't like that term because it suggests that we're trying too hard, but we'll say that her um, differentiator is that she is capable of so much, and is just a superstar when it comes to someone to work for, someone to have on your team, and just someone you really want in your corner. The challenge is that she was working for a boss who was totally disorganized, and basically left her team holding the bag, when she was kind of trying to keep up with everything and not really being focused on the right thing. Um, Yeah, we'll leave it at that. I can go into a lot more of this detail with my newsletter subscribers because it's a little bit more of a private space, but would just leave it at the fact that this is a super disorganized manager who, well, she's not even a manager, she's on the executive team, who is someone with influence and visibility that my client wanted access to. But on the flip side, she was constant chaos for my client because she was dropping in and basically disrupting her entire day and demanding her attention, even when she was in meetings, even when she was trying to deliver on things for her executive manager. What was really heartbreaking is that my client had actually come to me with a few different objectives that she wanted to get through out of coaching. And one of them was setting boundaries with this little tornado of a boss that she had. Um, Even very early on, she knew what the problem was. She knew she had to manage her boundaries and her time much better with her boss. But it just never happened. Week over week, she would come into coaching, and we would end up spending a lot of that time on how to work through the um, fire of the week, how to kind of manage the um, interruptions that were happening right then and there that her manager was bringing to her. And I say it was heartbreaking because she knew what needed to be done. She knew that this was behavior that couldn't continue, but because of the constant disruptions to her day, she just never had the headspace to actually focus on it. Or that's what we thought anyway. Until one day I kind of looked up from my notes and said, "Hey, did you realize that of all of the conversations we've had, it's not perfectly scientific, but I'd estimate about 80% of our time is spent talking about your boss." Not just managing her, but her behaviors, how she's interrupting you, everything that's going on in her world. And, that's notable because you came here to work on your career, on getting ahead, on being noticed. And even just the next session after that, she came in with new resolve. Basically, she showed up with, I'll say, renewed determination to stop that cycle because what had really happened was that she had let her boss take over not just her time at work, but her entire mind, her entire narrative. Based on the behaviors her boss was exhibiting. And again, newsletter subscribers will get into all those juicy details in private space. But it was behavior that was rewriting the reality of my client. And once we came to that realization, we could slowly separate her boss from herself so that she could see, okay, yes, I still deserve space. I still deserve to hold my boundaries. And the conversation became less about how do I respond on a constant one off basis with my boss to how do I hold strong to what I know is right? Of course, within the confines of still that person being her boss and um, we'll say eventually having that magic trump card that says, hey, you know what? Don't really care. You're still going to have to do it anyway. In across all of these scenarios and a lot more that I've seen in coaching and private conversations, especially with very seasoned senior experienced individuals, leaders, executives, when they come across something that they're feeling is something like procrastination or indecision or um, even what some of my clients call laziness, isn't really that, but having to see the situation in a different light, or even just giving themselves space to really examine something that their protective brain is flagging as something that's, hey, this is something that deserves being looked at, in opposition to the constant barrage of standard corporate training that's just make a decision, act on it, and move on. We have to go, go, go. Okay, and that's it for now. I'll see you next time.